Network as we discuss topics in politics, art, and current events.
Okay, welcome to Intelligent Talk. The website is intelligenttalk.com. We're here to discuss an interesting subject. The book is called Every Second Counts, and it's about the first heart transplant, which most people would have thought would have occurred in Europe or the United States, but did not. It actually occurred in South Africa in 1967 with a doctor named Dr. Christian Barnard. And we have here an author who has written really the definitive book on the subject. His name is Donald McRae. Mr. McRae, thank you for coming on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So if I could just start then, your book sort of begins in 1958, where there's a team of doctors competing. There's Dr. Barnard, there's Shumway, Lauer, who's sort of working as a team, and there's a person who many people think was key, the first pacemaker, Dr. Kantowitz. And the race begins in 1958 with Dr. Shumway in San Francisco and involves a dog heart. Could you please start the story with that and explain that?
Yeah, it's quite a fascinating tale because in 1958, the idea of transplanting a human heart was so outlandish that I don't think any of these doctors or anyone else was actually contemplating it as being possible. But Shumway and Lauer were young doctors. They were audacious, just starting out as surgeons. They didn't have a lot of work at that time. So in their spare time, they would go down into a dingy lab in San Francisco, and they started to kick about some fun ideas, as they like to say in their sort of laconic way. And one of their fun ideas was dealing in hypothermia, which is cold. And they decided that to attempt to see if they could stop a heart in a dog and see if they could freeze that heart in cold saline. And then after a certain time, they were thinking 15 or 20 minutes, and the ideal was to go for an hour. After an hour, would they be able to start the heart again? This was bold and audacious, and they did attempt it, and they were absolutely stunned in the summer of 58 when they stopped the dog's heart for 60 minutes and then got it back working again, and the dog was licking their hands and being a typical dog, and they just suddenly thought, we can use this technique to think about transplantation.
Okay, and your book also sort of involves a history, in a way, of transplants as well. I think you say the first successful kidney transplant was in, I think, 1950?
Yeah, I think it was then, yes.
And could you tell me how the knowledge of, like, the kidney transplant helped to sort of guide the way for the heart transplant? What similarities have come to mind?
Well, the kidney, as the surgeons themselves told me, was a much more technically challenging op to do. But it was successful, but it was always quite difficult because the body would tend to attack the new donor kidney. So Shumway and Lauer were aware that once the op had been completed, the kidney transplantation had showed that there were always going to be a minefield of difficulties in stopping the body attacking this new organ that was keeping it alive. But they were heartened by the fact that, excuse the cliche, heartened, I didn't mean that, but they were just emboldened by the fact that technically it is much simpler to transplant a heart than a kidney. So they began to work methodically towards this objective, but they were not so concerned with being the first because no one else was actually thinking about transplanting a heart. They were scientific men, and they decided they're going to work slowly, even if it took 10, 20 years. Once they had got to the point where they felt they would help a body accept a new donor heart, that would be the time to go. But of course, other surgeons, Kantowitz in New York, and later Barnard in South Africa, they wanted to push ahead much more quickly. So we had this fascinating, not a battle, but all these four surgeons were all attempting, in a way, to be the first.
Yes, you mentioned Dr. Kantowitz, one of the early pioneers of the pacemaker. Could you explain briefly his contribution to this?
Yes, he'd done a lot of work in pacemakers, and he was a highly intelligent man. I met him in his sort of mid-80s, and even then, ideas just poured out of him. And he was dynamic, He was based in Brooklyn at Maimonides Hospital, and he was fascinated to learn in sort of the early 60s what Shumway and Lauer were doing. And he had quite a cosmopolitan team with him in Maimonides. There were surgeons from Japan, South Africa, England, and these young surgeons together in New York suddenly thought, Shumway and Lauer have given us an opportunity to do something. Let's see if we can start working in transplanting dog hearts. And Shumway and Lauer had also made a significant achievement. They had done an actual transplant from one dog to the other in sort of December the 31st, 1959. And that made the front page of the New York Times. It was a huge deal. The dog did not last for more than, I think, about 5 or 6 days because the body immediately started attacking the donor heart. But again, Shumway and Lauer had given the key to say that this was possible. Kantrowitz was a bold man, and he thought, well, technically it's a simple operation to do. And he thought, I'm going to push harder and harder. And he began to do enormous work in transplanting dog hearts in the lab. And he was quite successful. Some of his dogs were living for many months. And jumping ahead, in 1966, on an early morning in June, about sort of 1 o'clock in the morning, in the surgical theater, Kantrowitz was on the cusp of immortality. He was about to transplant the first human heart. This is now 18 months before it was actually done in South Africa. And Kantrowitz had 2 babies. One, the donor baby, was an anencephalic patient, which means that the body is effectively born without a brain. That's a simplistic term, but explanation. But that's the body is brain dead. But the heart in this donor baby, who's only a few days old, looked good. And another baby was dying with congenital heart defects and only had days to live. So Kantrowitz said, now is the time. I've spent so long in the labs working on dogs. He'd done a lot of work on puppies, so he knew he could deal with a minuscule heart. And he was just about to do it when 2 of the senior members of his surgical team actually intervened and said, no, you cannot play God. You cannot do this. And so they had this existential debate over these 2 babies' bodies, both still alive, the anencephalic baby, of course, with no consciousness, but the baby needing a new heart, dying, and so Kantrowitz knew he just had days to save this baby. And the 2 older men kept saying to him, look, the baby is perfect. Beyond, they covered the anencephalic baby's head with a towel, so we just had the perfect torso. And they're saying, you cannot touch this baby until it actually dies, then you can take the heart. Kantrowitz would tear off the towel and he would make them look into the shattered face and shattered head of the baby who'd been born an anencephalic. And he would say, look, there's no consciousness there. So it was this whole debate, what defines death? For Kantrowitz, it was the mind, consciousness, which makes us human. The older men were saying, no, it is the heartbeat that defines life. So this was a huge debate, but in the end, Kantrowitz was forced to step down. He couldn't do the transplant that night. Both babies died within a day.
Could I just summarize? So Kantrowitz pulled ahead of Shumway then, and he would have been the first person to do it if but for that ethical debate. Is that fair to say?
Yes. That was not known. I only learnt about it sort of in the early 2000s. It was known within surgical circles, but publicly no one knew about this. And for me, this was a momentous thing that 18 months before Chris Barnard, the South African, did the first transplant, Kantrowitz was so close to doing it.
Yes, let me just turn to Dr. Barnard, because obviously he is the person who was the first, and I just want to briefly discuss some of his background, because you mentioned he was raised, obviously, in South Africa. I believe his father was a Methodist minister to primarily a black congregation. Is that right?
Well, it was mainly white people. They lived in an Afrikaans, which was like a farm sort of community. But they were good people, and sometimes black people were allowed into the church, but on the whole, he was talking to white people in his church.
Was he considered a bit of an outsider in South Africa? I mean, having some blacks in the church, was he considered any kind of a rebel, his father? Or?
I don't think hugely so. They were quite a conservative family at the same time. Look, they had some compassion, and so I think occasionally a black person could come into the church, but they weren't doing anything particularly to help black people.
Okay.
And Chris Barnard's own political views were definitely conservative. He, though, was highly intelligent, went to the University of Cape Town, showed a lot of flair, a lot of imagination, and he was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go study in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota. And they had a wonderful sort of heart team there who were doing such cutting-edge work. Funny enough, Norm Shumway was also studying at the same time. So Shumway and Barnard were sort of classmates and didn't get on because Shumway was quite an urbane, sophisticated, witty man. Barnard was definitely an outsider. He had a thick South African accent in Afrikaner, a conservative man. He was intense, not a lot of humor to him, especially in those days. And they clashed, and it's ironic that the two of them, 15 years down the line, were battling to be the first. But Barnard wasn't particularly compelled by transplantation. He was doing a lot of other significant and innovative work in the heart and other parts of the body. But for him, a big turning point came in 1966. He went to Virginia to meet with David Hume, who was the pioneer who had done so much work on the first kidney transplants. And Barnard was thinking about doing the first kidney transplant in Africa. So he went to meet Hume and spend a couple of weeks with Hume in Virginia. While he was there, one of his former members of his surgical team, the perfusionist, a guy called Carl Gerson, was actually working in Virginia. And he said to Chris Barnard, "Chris, you must go into Dick Lauer's lab. They're transplanting dog hearts." Barnard said, "What?" So he said, "Come, we'll go see." Dick said, "Yeah, sure." He was an open man, Dick Lauer. And this he now left Shumway, and he was in Virginia. And Dick Lauer, using the same techniques that he and Shumway had developed in San Francisco, was also coming close to doing the first human heart transplant. So Barnard sat one afternoon in Virginia and watched Lauer move a heart from one dog into another. And he said, "My God, is that all it is?" And Lauer said, "Yes, technically it's such a simple thing to do." So Barnard went out and he said to Carl, his former perfusionist from Cape Town, "Wow, that's so easy. I'm going to go out and do it."
Okay. So
Carl said, "But yeah, okay."
So that really I want to go back to one thing you said about Minnesota. I think you say in the book in the 50s there were only 2 hospitals in the U.S. doing open heart surgery, and they were both in Minnesota. Is that right?
To be honest, it's such a long time, many years since I did the book.
Okay.
If it says that in the book, then I'm sure that's the case. I can't comment that.
I remember when my grandfather was sick, he went to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and I visited him there, and I remember, it was amazing to me that such a top-rate facility existed in such a desolate area. And
absolutely. There was a guy, John Kirkland, I think, at Mayo, who was doing wonderful work. And I don't know how it worked, but Minnesota was sort of the heartland, to use another cliche of the heart.
Do you know why that was? Why Minnesota was there?
I don't. Beyond, I think, once you get some fertile, highly imaginative minds working in one place, other people are pulled towards that place. And they just had such a high reputation that people just wanted to learn from them.
I want to just talk briefly about Barnard's personality, and then obviously go back to his training and obviously the Operation 67. But you say that Barnard is kind of a morally ambiguous person. Obviously, his personal life was kind of a mess. He was having a bunch of affairs. He didn't really seemed oblivious to apartheid around him. Could you just discuss briefly him as a person, Barnard?
Yes, he was a complicated man. He wasn't, as a surgeon, he wasn't particularly good. He would get quite emotional. He would shout at his staff in the midst of an operation. But as a doctor, once the surgical mask was taken off, he was highly intuitive, and he could pick out little things why the patient wasn't doing so well. So there was this sort of ambivalence in him as a doctor and a surgeon, and similarly as a person. He could be hugely compassionate, but he was ambitious, and he was just pushing to do something that would make his name. And transplantation was the golden key for him to make him, as it turned out, the most famous man in the world for a while. And when he got to that point, he certainly took advantage, and he had lots of affairs, and he lived the high life.
Could you discuss also one of the reasons, am I correct, that South Africa certified death differently than the U.S.? South Africa, you had to have 2 doctors certifying death.
Yes, and South Africa, was at the height of apartheid. So the focus of the government and the lawmakers was basically to ensure white power stayed intact. So things like medical legislation were almost just shunted to one side. And so in South Africa, it was much looser, and they could define death. They could have the idea of brain death, that you could take the donor heart from a patient who'd been in a car accident who was brain dead. In the U.S., it was much more complicated, because in the U.S., the definition of life was the heartbeat. If the heartbeat stopped, people would say, well, that person is now dead, which of course we can all understand that. But what the surgeons all felt is that actually the heart was just a pump. But what defines humanity is consciousness, is the brain. And if the brain is dead, the person is dead. And so Barnard was fortunate in the sense that in South Africa, medical legislation was fairly loose. He just needed a couple of doctors and his immediate boss to say, okay, you can take the heart of a brain-dead patient. In the States, they couldn't do that. So Barnard had a huge advantage in being the first in that sense.
Now, I'd like to go to the heart of the book, obviously, the operation itself in 1967. And you were saying earlier that Barnard he'd been in Virginia in, did you say 1966, right before this?
In 1966, yeah.
Right, and could just very succinctly, what did he learn in Virginia in 1966 that allowed him to do it in 1967? What was the key thing?
Just that it was technically a simple procedure that just gave him such confidence. He said, I'm going to do some transplants in dogs. He did about, it's in the book, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but I think he did about 40 or 50. And his dogs did not live for more than a few days. But he still just thought, I'm going to go ahead and do it. So this was the kind of man he was, where Shumway and Lauer were much more methodical and thought, well, our dogs need to be living for a year before we can start thinking about doing this in a human being.
Okay, so now we're in 1967. We're doing the operation. They take a female heart and they implant it in a man. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, could you just describe briefly? I mean, what the problem? I mean, at one point one of the subjects was going to be black, right? And didn't Barnard say no? We can't do that. It has to be.
The first operation happened in early December 1967, but a couple of weeks before that, in South Africa, they had a donor patient who, in South African terminology, was coloured, which means a mixed-race person. Barnard was set to do it. He didn't think anything of the political consequences, but his boss, the chief cardiologist, said, no, you cannot do it because the world will go crazy if you're taking the heart of a black person and putting it in the body of a white person. It'll look so bad. So Barnard was blocked there.
Okay.
But he was fortunate. A few weeks later, a young woman, white woman, was in a car accident. She was brain dead. The heart was still beating, and he was given permission to take her heart and put it in the body of an older white man who survived for about 17 days.
Could you just briefly describe, I mean, just in very basic terms, what the operation was and how they, I mean, the woman's heart was substantially smaller than the man's, right? But they weren't certain if it was going to work, but it ended up working fine?
Yeah, I think for Barnard said it was for him such an existential moment because they opened the chest of the patient, the man who was going to get the new heart, and his heart was huge. It looked like it belonged to a whale.
Right.
They then opened the chest of the young woman whose heart they were going to take, and that heart was much smaller. So they weren't sure if it was going to be able to support this large male body, but they just moved ahead. And Barnard said, because basically once you take the heart out of the recipient, the body's being kept alive by a heart-lung machine. But Barnard took out the heart, and he said it was unbelievable. He looked into this empty chest cavity. This person is still alive, kept alive by the machine, but there's no heart.
Okay.
And he paused for a few seconds and thought, oh my God, what am I doing? But then he took the donor heart of the woman and they put it into the chest of the man, stitched it up. There's complicated things they had to do in terms of shocking it and warming the heart. But after whatever it was, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, the heart began to pump. And that was a wonderful moment for them, that life was now being given from a dead woman to a living man.
And that heart, it lasted quite some time, didn't it, in this man?
Yeah, it lasted for about 17 days. And when as I said earlier, his dogs were not surviving for more than a couple of days. This shows that Barnard, for all his flaws and his excitement and agitation in the surgical theatre, he was quite gifted. And he did keep his first patient alive for 17 days. And the doctors who followed him soon afterwards, their patients did not last for more than a couple of days, sometimes even only hours.
Why do you think that was? I mean, I know you write in the book that Barnard stays up, almost becomes like a robot. He avoids food and eating and just focuses solely on the patient. Was it just his care that caused that?
Yeah, well, that's what I said. He's such an ambivalent man that he was so ambitious and he merciless towards other people. But he was compassionate towards his patients and also had this intuitive ability to, obviously this is in the 60s, so they didn't have the kind of technology that surgeons have and doctors have today. But just with the naked eye, he would look at a patient and think, there's something up with this guy's kidney. It's battling to support the new heart. And he would then focus on helping the kidney. So he had some special talents, there's no doubt about that.
Were there any, do you remember if there were any anti-rejection drugs at this time were used? Or?
Yes, there were, but they were in their infancy, and so they weren't working particularly well. And it was only, it got to the point where they basically said no more heart transplants are allowed in the world because the patients were just dying so quickly. And it was then when Shumway and Lauer, again, the two guys who'd started the whole thing in the dog lab in 1958, they did all the hard work in the 1970s working out how they could help the body deal with a new donor heart and stop the body attacking the donor heart. But it was a long battle. So Barnard won the war. He was the first. He won the battle, but the people who won the war were Shumway and Lauer because they were the two guys who actually enabled transplantation to become the successful operation that it is today.
Could you explain, just for people that weren't around in 1967, what it was like, the kind of fame that Barnard had, and maybe how that changed him as a person?
Yeah, well, I was only 6 years old in 67, so for me as a South African, it had a huge impact on me as a tiny little boy. I suddenly knew the world was agog with what this man had done. And I think you've got to put it in context. In the 60s, I guess the main objective of many of the U.S. and the Soviet Union had been to put a man on the moon. And that sort of was a compelling race to see who could be first. But the first human heart transplant was not far behind that because the human heart is such an evocative organ. We talk about a heart breaking when we're falling in and out of love. Our heart sings. So people just could understand that the heart was this wonderful organ that means so much. And so when the first transplant happened, Barnard was just a huge figure of fascination. He was immediately flown to the U.S. to do wall-to-wall television shows. He was taken to the White House to meet the president, Johnson, and he met the Pope. Movie stars wanted to meet him. He was just this iconic figure. He was a cover of Time magazine. And for him, as a young farm boy from the Afrikaans heartlands of South Africa, to suddenly be in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and New York and London and being feted, it just totally went to his head.
Okay. Let's just speak about the post-67 Barnard. And you spoke with Barnard's brother, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, he was part of the team that had done the first heart transplant, and also his daughter, who was an invaluable witness, loved her father, but was also able to articulate some of his flaws. And, she saw how her mother had suffered because Chris left his wife and got divorced soon after his surgical fame exploded, and he was immediately engaged to a 19-year-old model, and at the same time having affairs with lots of movie stars. So he was ambitious in medical terms, but once he made it, he actually became obsessed with his fame and the high life, and unfortunately squandered his talents.
Right, that's what I was just going to say. He never really achieved much after that, never anything like what he had before.
Well, he did a little bit. I mean, he did the fourth heart transplant. He was a patient called Philip Bleiberg, and this was in early '68, and that patient lived for 18 months. And about his fourth or fifth transplant, the patient lived for years. So he had success, but instead of staying in the theatre and working, he was too busy going and saying, "Oh, I'm off to Monaco," or "I'm off to LA." He just was seduced totally by fame and glamour. And the surgical team back home in Cape Town was thinking, "Gosh, we're making such headway. We should keep going." But he was seduced by, the high life, unfortunately.
Also, one of the things that he mentioned, arthritis. You mentioned that in the book. That I wonder if that was at all psychosomatic, or was it really a serious condition that prevented him from working?
No, it was, even as a young man, he suffered, and his hands, you can sometimes see photos, his hands are gnarled and twisted, and he had a lot of pain. So again, even though my own sort of support is with the U.S. surgeons who did all the hard work, and they lost the opportunity to be the first, and Barnard's politics didn't coincide with what my beliefs are, but at the same time, you have to say he overcame enormous odds, and one of that was the fact that, yes, his hands were not working so well, and he suffered a lot of pain.
Okay. I think I mentioned to you in an email earlier, too. I had read that Peter Sellers, the actor who was in the Pink Panther movies, was planning to get an operation by Barnard, and obviously Sellers died in 1980 before he could do that. Did you ever hear anything about that, between the Barnard-Sellers friendship?
I had heard about it, and yes, it tallied with the fact that Barnard, again, Peter Sellers was a famous actor, so Barnard was happy to go see him, and he knew he'd been in the newspapers. So yeah, that was typical of Barnard, that he was, his clientele changed, and they were famous people he was more keen to talk to, perhaps.
Just in summing up, then, if we, in the life of Dr. Barnard, and obviously having completed this operation, is it fair to say that people like Barnard push the envelope? They may be difficult people, as sort of people like Steve Jobs were. They may be hard to get along with, but they sort of push the envelope of human advancement, and in that sense, they are valuable people to have.
Definitely. The difficulty with this sort of particular case is that he was only one of four who were all so close. The other surgeons, I think, had done much more work, and they were all on the cusp of doing it. I mean, they all were within hours of being the first. But Barnard, yes, he was the one who was the most audacious and pushed the envelope quicker than any of them. And Shumway, who I think most people feel should have been the first, he found this enormously difficult that Barnard had beaten him. But when I met Shumway close to his death, and Shumway had been living for 40 years with being the second or the third, well, he was the third to do it. And he said it's painful because they all forget the guy who was second or third. It's always about the guy who was first. And he didn't like Barnard. He hadn't liked them when they were students together in Minnesota. He hated his style, his obsession with fame. But he did say to me, he said, it's hard for me to admit this, but Barnard did a huge thing for the benefit of all of us surgeons and for humanity. He pushed the envelope when it came to the definition of death. U.S. legislation was still banging away that the heartbeat defined life. Barnard was the one who said, no, life and death is defined by consciousness or the absence of consciousness. So Shumway, he paid this huge plaudit to Barnard, which I thought was magnanimous of him.
That's fascinating. How long before you wrote the book did you meet Shumway? Was that like 2001 or so, or 99?
The book came out in 2006, so I was sort of talking to Shumway sort of about 2004 to 2005, He was a man, it was hard to get access to him because he was a private individual, and this had hurt him hugely. He didn't want to talk about it.
Okay.
But Dick Lauer and I got on fantastically well, and Dick knew no one else had attempted to tell the story. And Dick said to Shumway, "You've got to meet Don." And although he's a South African, he's actually open to what we were doing. And then when I met Shumway, he was a wonderfully warm and expansive person to talk to, and I was lucky enough to be with him in Stanford to see what the work being done in Stanford in the early 2000s was, and it was all built on Norm Shumway's vision. And I think at the end he had some peace because he knew that he had actually, as I said, he'd won the war,
right,
even though Barnard won the famous battle.
Yeah, it's kind of like the second person landing on the moon. No one really knows who the second person is. We all know Neil Armstrong. And just to sum up then, Barnard, would you say he had the greater will or determination, not necessarily the better surgeon or a better doctor, but just he had the most drive of the four? Would that be fair to say?
Well, no, because I think they all were absolutely compelled and worked so hard. It was just a sort of a more personality difference. Shumway and Lauer were scientists. They thought, let's be methodical, let's work slowly, let's make sure we do it as well as we can. They didn't think about being the first. But Barnard thought first, I'm going to be the guy to do it. The science was sort of to the side. But then, as I said earlier, the weird thing is that actually he was more successful. His patients lasted longer. So it's quite a multi-layered story. And, I admired all four of them hugely.
Do you think fame was in the back of his head when he was doing that operation in '67? Was he thinking about going to Monaco and hanging out?
No, I don't think so. I think he was taken aback by how his life would change. I think he knew that in surgical circles it would be a huge milestone, and he would get a lot of accolades for being the first. But I don't think anyone expected it would be such huge news. So he was taken aback and just excited by how his life had changed.
Okay. And obviously the legacy of those operations, I think there's something like, I read 2,500 a year now done, maybe more than that, but that's the number that I saw. But it's...
I think that would be almost perhaps just in the States. I think they were certainly. I think maybe 6,000 or so globally. Okay. That's just a figure that stays in my head. I would have to check that. But it's become a fairly, people are used to the idea of transplantation of the heart. Whereas in the 1960s, it was the Wild West. People just could not believe it was possible to do. Whereas now, if we hear that a colleague or a family member needs a heart transplant, it's a huge deal, of course. But we all can go into that thinking, well, there's a good chance that this loved person can maybe have another 5, 10, 15, 20 years of good life. And that, again, is all down to those early pioneers, I think.
Well, just one final question before I wrap this up. But a lot of animals were used in these experiments, dogs and chimpanzees, etc. Do you think there's anything to discuss the morality of that? I mean, is it just necessary? Number two, could that same climate allow that to occur today, do you think? Or was there any difference in the 60s versus today?
No, I think things have changed, and people would be much more skeptical about dogs being used in the lab and cats. But the surgeons themselves asked this question, and they sort of said, look, we were animal lovers, and we got on, we cared for these animals, but they said human life was more important to us than the lives of a cat or a dog. But, yes, there were some ethical differences in their outlook to perhaps what we would feel ourselves today, and I don't think it could be done in the same way in 2018.
May I ask you, are you working on any books now, any new books?
Yes, I've just finished a book, completely different subject. It's set in Belfast in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s at the height of the troubles between the Catholics and Protestants. So couldn't be more different, but it's about people and humanity and some good people and not good people, and I'm enjoying working on that.
Wonderful. And are you at the Guardian newspaper too? Is that right? Did I read that?
Yes, I write a sports interview, which I do once a week, and I was actually just starting to do that when I began to work on this book. And the surgeons loved it because I said, I was hopeless at science at school, know nothing about biology. Do you mind talking to me? And they just loved talking to me because they would explain to me the basics, and they knew I was actually more concerned about the human side of their work. And I have to say they couldn't have been more supportive of me. And they also understood, in a way, it became a bit like a sporting event because they all were vying with each other to be the first.
Very well. Well, Mr. McRae, thank you so much for your time. The book was Every Second Counts. This is intelligenttalk.com, and thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Our nation's armed forces, and you're looking for a way to continue serving your fellow veterans in your community, then join AMVETS. Each year, AMVETS members volunteer millions of hours at VA healthcare facilities from coast to coast, helping to improve the lives of their fellow veterans through the VA Voluntary Services Program. AMVETS posts and departments also participate in a wide variety of community service projects, ranging from Americanism in our schools to supporting the Special Olympics and Boy Scouts of America. If you no longer wear the uniform today, you can still serve through the AMVETS by joining today at amvets.org.
Hi, I'm Janice Ian. Do you remember how excited you were at the start of summer every year, and how the summer just started to drag on after a few months and you couldn't wait to get back to school, see your old friends, make new friends, get new books and a new locker and a clean slate? Well, you should have been excited about music class too, because that was a special room where you went to sing, perform with your friends, and learn all kinds of interesting stuff about great composers, instruments, different kinds of music and songs. We remember our music teachers because they were so passionate about helping us learn to love music. They helped to spark a love for listening to notes and voices and rhythms that continues to enrich our lives even today. I bet your kids feel the same way about music class. Ask them, and make sure they get involved with music in school and in their lives.
A PSA brought to you by MENC, the National Association for Music Education, and the National Anthem Project, the campaign to restore America's voice through music education. Music, part of a sound education.
Sparky the Fire Dog here. Protect your family from fire. Make sure your home has smoke alarms in every bedroom, outside your sleeping areas, and on every level of your home, even your basement. For games and activities, go to sparky.org.
We want to keep you, your family, and your community